as Alice mentioned, a partner at the law firm of Wilmer Hale. We're a global full services law firm. My focus is on representing emerging companies, and in particular in the life sciences space. And that can be drug development companies, medical device companies, including diagnostic companies, and then other forms of companies that people often throw into life sciences generally, which more I think of as more healthcare companies or probably more traditional technology companies. So I represent those as well. As a corporate lawyer, my focus is on transactions. So the most common transaction and the thing that I'm most involved with early stage companies, entrepreneurs like yourself, is to help them fundraise. So helping advise them on how to structure a financing, how to negotiate it, and how to close it. And then I also work on other transactions as companies grow, M&A, mergers and acquisitions, both buy side and sell side. And some of my companies, particularly in the drug development space, tend to go public, so public offerings as well. So that gives me that gives you a sense a little bit more of what I do. Tom, could you describe what you do?
Sure. I work at Hydra Biosciences. It's a 13-year-old startup biotech company, the traditional Cambridge biotech story where you were founded on a certain science, and 5 years into it, the people that were in the room that you never really talked to present science that can see itself into the clinics within 3 years. We're poised to go into phase 1 trials in March and 2 phase 2 trials by the end of next year. I run all of finance, operations, HR, anything that's not science related, so I don't screw it up. I'm in charge of. Prior to Hydra, I was at Infinity Pharmaceuticals. I was the first finance person there. I was employee number 23. It's a cancer company. We took that public through a reverse merger. I left 3 months after that and started at Hydra. And prior to that, I was 10 years at KPMG as a senior audit manager, both in Boston and in Dublin, Ireland, where I was taking companies public in the dot-com boom, public on NASDAQ.
My name is Finny Kuruvilla. I'm a principal at Clarus Ventures. What I do is I'm a principal there where I primarily do scientific and clinical diligence on new companies. So we're a traditional venture capital firm. We have about $1.7 billion under management. And my background is more on the science medicine side. I'm an MD PhD. I trained here at Harvard, I did my PhD in chemistry. After med school, I did my residency and fellowship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, so I had plenty of opportunities to see patients, work in the trenches. After that, I spent some time at the Broad Institute, which is a joint Harvard-MIT institute where I worked in medical genetics. And so I spent lots of years on the science clinical side, and a lot of what being in venture capital is meeting new companies, trying to figure out what's going to be great ideas, successful ideas. And so I spent a lot of my time meeting with prospective companies, and then I spent probably 30% of my time on the boards of companies, helping build companies, trying to identify great management, taking companies through clinical trials, and ultimately generating an exit for the venture firm.
So in the spirit of making it interactive, we came up with a quiz, which all of you should have before you. I'm sure you didn't think tonight you were going to be taking a quiz, but you're about to. And I already can tell you the answer to your quiz, so you ace all of it. It's the beginning of the title of our presentation, right? One size does not fit all. So you've all aced the quiz. The point we're trying to accomplish tonight, I think the overall theme that you're going to see, and hopefully you'll see it through the different perspectives of each of us on the panel here, is that each of you is thinking about starting a company. Maybe you've already started a company. The science could be slightly different from the person sitting next to you. Your goals, short run and long run, could be very different from the person sitting next to you. So we're going to talk about a lot of topics tonight, and you'll see them touched upon in your quiz that will actually hopefully help you to see how you will think about these issues from your perspective. It may not be the same as somebody else who's in a similar business or somebody else who's using a very different science. But the idea here is to flag issues for you, help you think about them in a more detailed manner so that when they come up in practice, you'll know what questions to ask, who to ask those questions to, and how to work on moving your company forward, because there's not always a right or wrong, but I think each of us will give you a sense of what we think are the best practices for you, depending on what your company is, what you're trying to accomplish, both short-term and long-term, what those goals are, both from a business perspective as well as from a scientific perspective. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Briefly, we have 4 hypotheticals in front of you, 4 businesses that are very much different. On the one hand, you may be thinking about starting a therapeutics company. That's your first hypothetical. I'm not going to read all of what's before you, but I want to give you a sense of, for those companies, as I'm sure you know, you have to think about clinical trials. And that means raising a fair amount of capital and a long time horizon in terms of getting those potential drug candidates through discovery and then into development, preclinical, to the different stages of clinical trial before the FDA or another foreign regulatory agency that's comparable to the FDA approves the drug candidate for sale and marketing. That company is going to come at these issues from a different perspective than your second company. The hypothetical number 2 is a medical device company. And in this example, I want you to think of it as a diagnostics company. And this diagnostics company has to think about whether or not, from a regulatory perspective, it needs pre-market approval by the FDA. So that's more of the full approval, to the extent that you're not familiar with that, rather than 510(k) clearance, which is a more simple path to regulatory approval, actually known as clearance by the FDA. For that reason, you can imagine, compared to a therapeutics company, you're actually going to need, relatively speaking, less capital than the therapeutics company, and your time horizon to commercialization and or sale of the company is generally going to be less, fewer years. Hypothetical number 3 is intended to give you a sense of another type of device company. In this case, I've assumed it's not a device company that is a diagnostics company, but a general device company that won't need pre-market approval. Therefore, you won't have necessarily human clinical trials, at least in the extensive kind that a diagnostics company that is actually going for PMA rather than 510 clearance will need. So in this case, you actually may see even less money required and less time to move the business forward. Last hypothetical, probably the easiest from the perspective of you don't need to deal with regulatory approval as a general matter when you're simply a software company playing in the life sciences space. You may be a healthcare IT company and therefore think of yourself as being in the health and science market, but obviously that's a very different company from a regulatory perspective. So try to keep these differences in mind. You probably all have a different idea in terms of what you're pursuing. With those hypotheticals in mind, now I want to open it up to someone in the audience. And I do know a few of you, so if we don't have volunteers, I may volunteer you. And I want to get a sense from the audience of what some of your thoughts are before I ask Tom and Finny to weigh in and give their thoughts as to how to think about these particular issues. So for each of the 4 hypotheticals, but we'll start with the therapeutics company to start. If you're a drug development company, over the life of your company, how much money do you think you will need to raise from third parties? Any guesses? Anyone know? Yes? Any other thoughts? Anyone read anything else? Hear a different number? Similar answers? $4 billion? Over $1 billion, okay. So over the life of a company that is a therapeutics or drug development company, how much money do you expect approximately you'll need to run that company from inception to end result, typically a sale of the company?
So I think if you're just looking at one specific program and you're not accounting for any failures along the way, you might be able to do it with a few $100 million. But that's the minimum. Vertex, I think it took them 3.5 to break even, to make their first positive, their first income.
Okay. All right, and one more. Yes, a question or a comment? Yeah.
Pushing all the clinical trials will be long.
So let's assume one primary drug candidate, and getting through all clinical trials through FDA approval.
Yes, the time frame is 10 years to be approved, which is like
right. And the question is dollars, $1 billion over 10 years. Okay, so let's turn it over to our panel because both of them have been involved in different capacities with drug development companies. Tom, why don't we start with you? What's a number that you commonly hear or that you've seen?
It's a lot of money, more money than I have. And I think it depends on the indication. So if you're a cancer company, it's going to be a little bit less because the trials are going to be a little bit shorter. You don't have as many hurdles. If you're a pain company, the trials are much longer because, especially if it's chronic use, you have to do extended trials. Patient size could be thousands of patients. So I've heard 10 to 12 years, over $1 billion. And I think that's probably not a crazy number, but that assumes probably a lot of success too. I wouldn't be shocked if it's $2 billion and,
With failures.
with failures.
Yeah, Finny, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the title of the panel is very appropriate. One size fits all. It varies tremendously. So there are actually a lot of examples of much smaller amounts of capital being raised to generate very successful companies. So the reason that $2.6 billion that someone quoted, which is from a recent study, the Demasi et al. Study from Tufts, is a bit misleading is because that also includes these huge pharma trials that are Alzheimer's studies, diabetes studies. They're not the kinds of companies that are likely going to get started in the innovation lab or even that a Clarus Ventures would fund. There are examples of companies that serve these so-called orphan disease markets that are very, very small patient populations, sometimes 100 patients, a couple hundred patients in the world that have this disease. And there's examples of people going from start to finish in $50 million. So the 1 billion large number is, as I said, skewed a bit, and it just depends a lot on what indication you want to pursue.
And I would say that it's also what is the end, right? Is the end you're going to take this drug to market and sell it to patients, or is the end that you're going to take it to phase 1 clinical trials and then you're going to try to sell it to a big pharma or a bigger biotech company? And obviously those endpoints accelerate you getting out and therefore shorten how much money you need. And as we go through the conversations tonight, I'll probably keep bringing back, what is your goal, what is your plan, and what are your kind of individual milestones to get there?
Okay. With that in mind, and I don't want to go through all the hypotheticals in a great level of detail on this particular question, because I think, as you can see, even just picking one type of a company, we still are getting the answer, it depends. And I'm sure even in the answers that we saw here, right, there were 4 answers from the audience. We had 200 million on the low end, $1 billion, $2.5 billion. There are different numbers that you hear out there, and it certainly depends on how you're going to run your business. And I think both Finny and Tom have given you, whether it's the indication, some of the conversation showed, well, how many programs do you have? How many drug candidates do you have? I mean, it does depend on your business plan. So I think it underscores the need, whether you're a drug development company, a therapeutics company at the early stages, or a device company, when you develop that business plan, the executive summary, when you're making your pitch to investors, and we'll get into this in a little more detail as we go, think about what are you pitching? What is that model going to look like? What is your end goal? Because two people starting 2 very similar therapeutics companies, one may think that they're going to license out to big pharma after 2 years. Another may plan to do it on its own at some level and take it public and then sell it to a big pharma. So that can impact what your very long-term plans are going to be and what you put forth in a pitch to investors. So with that in mind, do people have a sense of, if you're going out and you're going to, let's assume a venture capital financing, and you're going to knock on Finny's door, you're probably not going to do that, but you're going to try to get in touch with him as soon as this panel's over and talk to him about your technology and say, Clarus is a well-known global investment firm, typical venture capital firm. I'm going to look to a VC to probably raise my first round of financing. What do we think the typical fundraise is for this type of a company? Again, we're going to start with the therapeutics company because we know it needs the most amount of money. What is a therapeutics company or drug development company typically going to look to raise in its Series A round, as people would most often call it? Anyone? Yes, sure.
Maybe 10 million?
Okay.
It depends again. I think there are companies that do 10 million because they have one specific target and one compound that they want to advance against that. And then there are companies like the third rock companies of the world that have a specific technology platform It is much earlier stage that they first need to validate, and they want to address multiple different disease targets with that, and they might raise $50 million. Yeah.
Any other thoughts before I ask the experts? Okay, we'll start with Finny this time. Finny, what do you typically, what does Clarus investment typically look like, and what do companies typically asking for?
A typical Series A would be 20 to 30 million, I would say, is the vanilla Series A. It can be lower than that. It would be unusual for the blue chip type investors, the Third Rocks, the Claruses of the world, to do those. They can be as high as 50 to 60. Rarely it would be higher than that.
Tom, what's your experience been like? Because you've been a part of multiple venture-backed companies.
It definitely depends on the stage of the company, and also the team around the company, because the VCs aren't investing in the technology; they're investing in the technology and the team. And there's a component there of trust and people that have been there and done it. Because these people are giving over a lot of money and hoping that you're going to give them money back plus some. And so as they look at it, I was just talking to someone today. She is looking at a $5 million Series A round, right, to get her company going. She has about $1 million from angels, to a company where there's more experienced people. This was her first company, to a company that has more experienced people where they raised $30 million. But I will tell you, those numbers are kind of a little skewed because most of the raises are tranched, right? You'll hear this word where you'll read it in the paper, oh, this company raised $40 million. Well, yes, they did, but they have to achieve certain goals to get all $40 million. Usually it's $10 million up front, or some number that's determined, oh, this money will get them to this goal, and then we have more validation that the science works, and then that will trigger the second tranche, and then they're off to the races. So it's definitely contingent on facts, but it's also contingent upon the science and the team and where it is. And no matter how much money you raise, it will definitely be kind of held back until you prove that you're moving along.
Okay. So when we think about most of the companies, the individuals that are here starting companies, I want to get a sense from, I'm going to start with Tom on this one, and move to Finny, and we could add the audience on this one as we move forward. How does one typically think of who their investor should be, right? There are different places where as an early stage life sciences company, you can look to raise money. We've started with almost the assumption in all circumstances that I'm going to be looking to a venture capital firm to do it. And Finny's here to talk about his experience with Clarus, a venture capital firm. But there are obviously other ways you can raise money. But for an early stage company, are they looking at VCs most of the time? And to what extent does that vary in your experience?
I would say my early experience, it was all VC. I think over time, it's changed. Most people that want to start a company, it's their baby, right? You've sweated over it. You're the one that put all the effort into kind of taking it to the point where it is. As soon as you bring in VC money, the games change, because now someone gave you a lot of money, and now they own a piece of the company, and they're going to have input on how that company's run and where and the goals that you need to achieve. And when that discussion happens, one of the big topics is around valuation. You think your company's worth a lot of money. You put all your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and you can see the end game of what's going to happen. So you have placed a lot of value on that, where VCs will come at it and say, yes, we believe that you can do this, but you haven't done it yet, and we think it's worth X. And so there's that dance. And so a long-winded way to get to your answer, what a lot of companies are doing now is they're not looking at VCs right when they start a company. They're looking at angels, right? They're networking at Harvard to try to meet people that have a lot of money in their pockets and are looking to kind of help startup companies to try to get in on the ground floor. They think the technology is cool, or it hits something that really is passionate to them, and they'll help fund the company in the early parts to help you prove out some of your hypotheses, to kind of move it on a little bit further, to get it closer to where when you're talking with the VCs, the value play is you can kind of have a little bit more say in it. Also, you're closer to maybe bigger value inflection points, and getting more money for that to really drive your science forward. So I think there's SBIR grants. Basically a lot of people are just trying to figure out how do they cobble enough money together to kind of move their company forward before they go out to VCs. I think that's the big takeaway.
And before I turn it over to the VC, you and I as non-VCs have experience where I have clients that come to me with, Finny, maybe this will surprise you, maybe not, the anti-VC mentality, right? Where they're gonna take everything, or the percentage of the company that they take is going to be too big, or control. They're not just gonna sit on the board, but they're gonna have veto rights over a number of things. Our next round of financing, for example, when we take money from this VC, will we be able to go out and do another round of financing with another VC? So Tom, what's your perspective on, you've been a management member at multiple venture-backed companies. What's it like to work with a VC? What do you think about that mentality? And we'll tell Finny to just close his ears for a minute.
Right. No, I probably have maybe bashed a little the VC world in some of my earlier comments, but VCs are great, right? They are a great way to access funds that you'll never be able to access to actually get your company to the next place, right? Hydra has raised $69 million just from VCs, and we wouldn't be where we are today if we didn't have that money. But there's always going to be this dance. I was consulting for a tech company that a couple of years ago that we were doing a Series B, and the movie, I forget the name of the title, but the Facebook movie was out, right? And so it was a pure tech company. It actually got bought by Twitter. And I was, I think, 10 hours over the course of 5 days in with the two founders, the CEO and the president of the company. And they were bringing up scenes from the Facebook movie. But how are they're going to get everything? And it's this constant, again, it's your baby. You own it. You don't want to just give it up. And what is that dynamic? And what I told them countless times is once you bring in a venture capital, or once you bring in even an angel, you've given a piece of it away. So you have to get comfortable with that early on, that once you start bringing money in that's not coming from your pocket, you've given away a little bit of your baby. And the dynamic there is, how do you give it away to someone that sees it the same way you are seeing it and working it? And I often think of VCs as it's kind of like dating, right? There's a lot of VCs out there, and they all have different personalities, and they all bring different things. And what you want to do is find the people that kind of match up to how you're thinking. It won't be one for one, and you should always remember, and again, this isn't a knock on VCs, their goal is to make money. Shocking, right? So ultimately, there's going to be some dialogue about them making money and you driving your science, and there's always going to be that pull, but in some ways that's helpful.
So Finny, I'm going to phrase it to you a little different, but what do you say to someone who is worried about working with a VC?
Yeah, so, and it's a very common anxiety that a person would have when they come to a venture capital firm. I would say a couple of things. The first is that especially if you get a good venture firm on your side, they will be one of the biggest assets. In fact, far more than the capital that's put into the company is the expertise, the networks, the brand name. I mean, if you get the brand name of a high-class venture firm on your company, it propels you to heights that are very difficult to attain if you're trying to bootstrap it on your own. And we've obviously done this with dozens of companies, and I think almost without exception, people will say there was all that anxiety, but then once we actually got going, once we had our board meetings, once I saw the value add that was contributed by the syndicate, not just one firm, but a whole group of firms, it was irreplaceable. I mean, especially with drug development today, it's so complicated, it's so rich, there's so much you have to know to get from idea all the way to FDA approval. You need a whole network of experts who are in your back pocket who can help you with this. And that's fundamentally what venture capitalists are, is we're people who collect expertise and build networks of consultants, networks of people who know the FDA, networks of people who know how to do commercial analyses, et cetera. And there's just no way. I mean, even myself, if I were starting a company today, having worked in venture now for 7 years, I would want I would want my company to be venture backed, because even though I've learned a lot in 7 years, I know that fundamentally it's about people. And to be able to bring all those people like that is very, very powerful. I mean, Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and Genentech, I mean, these companies, they're all venture-backed. I mean, most of the great companies we think about today in the American landscape, they're all venture-backed, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason that Kleiner Perkins and Excel and Sequoia and Third Rock and all these places have done well, it's because they bring an enormous amount of know-how there. So one of the first things I would do is I would say, just as much as the money component, think about the expertise that is being brought to the table. The experience of board meetings, in my opinion, is not thought about enough before people go out there. I mean, board meetings ought to be the absolute center of what you're imagining your company being going forward, and what is that whole interaction like? What are those dynamics like? And again, most people who are just starting off don't necessarily think about those dynamics. So I would say that first, and then secondly, I mean, this might sound a little bit strange, but you can use venture capitalists as a check on whether or not your idea is reasonable or not. So partly because it is your baby, you tend to be irrational, right? Love is blind, as they say. And if you go out and shop your company to 20 different venture firms and 20 people say no, maybe that's an opportunity to sit back and reflect and say, hey, maybe I need to go back and rethink things. Maybe the marketplace has spoken here, and I need to listen, as opposed to being too bullheaded and forging ahead and trying to pull together capital from less sophisticated investors who may not be able to see the warts as easily as people who are on the venture side. So I think there's a lot of value both on the negative side as the market check, but also on the positive side to create a great company that's ultimately going to bring the best of the best people together to create hopefully a lot of value all around. And in the end, incentives should be aligned. I mean, you're getting a piece of the company, the venture capitalist is getting a piece of the company, and the venture capitalists only win if the company wins. And because you own a piece of the company, hopefully you're just getting now a smaller piece of a bigger pie.
And I'll just add from my perspective, because I do get this question a lot from entrepreneurs for which I am forming companies, should I stay away from VCs? Or Josh, what's your experience been like in working with VCs? And Finny actually doesn't need to close his ears for this, because I don't believe that it's good to talk about the broad categories. In my experience, there are VCs that are sophisticated, have good networks, that offer expertise, in addition to the deep pockets. I mean, one reason to go to the VCs is because they have large funds and set aside reserves for follow-on investments. So if you need large amounts of capital, or at least you want to provide for the possibility of doing follow-on rounds with the same investor, that's a good place to go. But beyond the money, there is the experience, the expertise, the networks, other value that they can add beyond just simply writing you a check. They'll sit in the board meetings with you and help you think through the strategy. What is your mission? What are your goals? How are you achieving them? It's good to have other experience that they can bring to the table. The other thing I'll say is, I think it's not good to assume that simply because venture capitalists are sophisticated enough to know what to ask for, that they will, under all circumstances or most circumstances, give you a difficult deal, or a deal for which the terms are not as good, a lower valuation, take a larger percentage of your company, ask for more veto rights than, for example, some angels. Because many angels may not be all that sophisticated, right? Not every investor is the same. So I think it's important to think about who you're Think of it as an interview that you're doing with them. When you speak with them, try to get a sense of, whether it's an angel or a VC. What is their experience? How can they add value beyond just the capital? You think they'd be a good personality fit for working together? Because you are, for the most part, driving towards very similar goals over an extended period of time when you're all sitting around the board table. So I think it's important to remember those types of things. I think that certainly there are some VCs that have bad reputations, and clients I've had that have had bad experiences with VCs. But for every one of those clients, I can point you to another client that has had a bad experience with an angel, because either the angel group or the wealthy individual that's referring to them as an angel isn't as experienced in working with early stage companies as many venture capital firms are, isn't as risk tolerant as many venture capital firms might be, as an example, and is either driving a hard bargain in terms of the terms that they give you to begin with, or becomes more difficult to deal with down the road than you might otherwise have expected. So I think in general, you need to look beyond the money and don't think about maybe some of the stories you've heard, because at the end of the day, they're just anecdotes, and really just kind of do your own diligence carefully with all investors, because you may be surprised.
And just to follow up, I think it was said by everybody up here, it's a relationship. Two things. One, as you're talking to them, they're learning about you, you should be learning about them. And I agree with Finny. They're telling you things, and they might be telling you things that are hard to hear because they're telling you things about the baby that you're creating, right? But in those are truths. They're not there to kind of waste their time because they have 20 other things they could be doing. They're there because they thought the business plan was interesting, the science was interesting, and they're giving you their honest feedback. And you should incorporate that in how you think about it, and don't be blinded by, oh, they don't know anything, they're VCs, and I know my science. They see, how many proposals do you see in a given year?
We see about 1,000.
Right? Yeah. So they see a lot of things, and their feedback is invaluable. The other thing is, don't be blinded by dollars. I was talking to someone who did a financing, and there's a component that's going to be a follow-on financing, and now they're having logistical issues as it relates to interacting with the person that gave them the money. But it was a lot of money, and they just went for it. And with hindsight, they're like, probably shouldn't have done that. Maybe you should have done something differently. And again, it's the relationship. It is exactly like dating or getting married or that intimate relationship, because yes, VCs provide a great amount of support for the board, and yes, everything's in alignment when you're starting off, but like every relationship, it's going to get rocky, and there's going to be moments where you have to kind of like work it out. And knowing that there's a VC on that board that knows, has been there, can help you make it through, and know that you guys just kind of connect, that's important, because it's always going to happen. It's never rosy.
So I want to ask the audience this one. Number 5 in your quiz, if you're following along at home. Yes, Alice?
I had a question. Like Finny, you were saying in VCs, you see about 1,000 proposals, and then like if you went to 20 and they all say no, maybe you should kind of reevaluate where you stand. I'm curious, of the, like if there was a percentage, or are there ones that you see that the idea is not bad, it's just that the market's not big enough to be of interest?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I would say there's a fair bit of ideas that we see where the idea is actually reasonably sound, but in order to make a funding decision, you've got to have alignment of whatever the science is, the clinical development plan has to be reasonable, the amount of capital to get from here to whatever the exit would be, IP, regulatory. I mean, you're integrating 6 or 7 dimensions into this decision. And people, we certainly try to be as candid as we can in giving you feedback and saying, hey, this is the area that we think is the weak spot. You need to go revisit that. So absolutely. And that's, the commercial dimensions are also often those that are underappreciated at early stages, trying to imagine and calculate very reasonably what is the market size. So often people paint these ridiculously rosy pictures of what the market will be down the road.
And one thing to remember as we talk about this, I don't know anything about your companies, but I'm going to say the one thing that I do know, they're all worth nothing right now. It's what my mother used to say when I bought my first house. The house is only worth what someone's willing to pay for it, right? So when you're going into discussions or when you're thinking about raising money or talking to VCs, remember, it's not, you need partners, you need help to actually get to a point where it is worth something to somebody. And so just mind that during the conversations, that what you think it's worth, that's in your head, unless you've gone out and there's someone willing to write a check for that the next day, because that's the only truth. And that's the only thing that someone's going to say, oh yeah, I agree, it's worth $10 million, because someone's going to pay for $10 million.
So now to all of you, if you're planning that pitch to a potential investor, regardless of the type of investor that you anticipate it being, what do you think they're going to focus on most? When you make that pitch, what are you going to focus on? Yes?
Combination of technology and the team.
Which is more important?
I would say in the beginning the technology, but then eventually the team.
And why is that?
Well, if you don't have the technology, you wouldn't get funding for that specific project. The team could do something else potentially. But then if they agree to the technology, they want to know that the team can actually turn the technology into something valuable.
And what is it about the team specifically that you think an investor is going to focus in on?
Well, dedication, knowledge, also what you said earlier, that they have to fit within the team and with the VC.
Other ideas or thoughts? Yes?
target market or the target customer?
The target customer. What do you think is most important about the customer? At an early stage, it may be hard to anticipate who you have a business plan. Yes, go ahead.
They want to see the potential market if it can make money.
Right. Do you think that there's a typical size market that most investors in early stage life sciences companies are looking for in terms of a minimum amount of the size of the market over a period of time?
Yeah, compared to the competitors, what's your advantage over them?
Competitive advantage to your competitors. Okay. Well, good thoughts. Yes?
I have a question. But it's not in a drug, it's in the IT company. Can I start?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
So at which stage of the development of the software or the, I mentioned an IT company, you should approach a venture capitalist? And I mean, what type of firms should you approach? There are some firms that invest more in drugs, some of them invest more in IT. So what type of firms? And how is the best equation to the balance between approaching them once you develop a prototype, once you evaluate it? But I wouldn't agree what he said, because I would agree more that the team is more important. Sometimes you have the technology, then you refine it. So if you are good, then you can, because things don't work, all the time 100%. So if you have a good idea and it might not work in that way, just refine it, and that's make it easier, right?
Okay. Do either of you want to try to? There were some, I think, a couple of questions in there in terms of, when's the right time to start talking to investors? This maybe goes a little bit to question number 4 that I had. Is there a time that's too early to talk to investors? I think maybe we'll start with that for a second. Thoughts from either of you?
Yeah, so I should say, prefacing this, Clarus does not invest in healthcare IT firms, and so this is not an area that I have personal experience with. It's a completely different set of investors that are in the IT world as compared to the classic biotech device diagnostic world. It's a lot less capital intense, and so therefore you see a lot more companies that tend to be bootstrapped, where it's friends, family, angel investors, because people, they recognize you're not going to run some $30 million clinical trial. Normally, what I would say is, in terms of, is it too early to go to people? I rarely think it's too early to get the conversation going with people that you know, and just start to pressure test where people think is reasonable in terms of value inflection points, even to get a sense from a venture investor, if I get to such and such a point, would that be interesting to you? And if not, why not? Where are the stakes, so to speak? Where do the goalposts lie? And so I would say sooner rather than later would be very good. Again, that market check function is very important.
And I think, especially being at Harvard, you have access to a lot of people that have been there and done it. And I often think that we're not reinventing the wheel, right? I mean, we're inventing something new, but it's been done before, and you'd be surprised that people are open. They would love to sit down and hear what's going on and give you their stories, because there will be people that you meet and say, oh, I should have gone out earlier, or I went out too late, and I think, talking to people, I call them mentors, right? You could throw whatever title you want, and it could be VCs, or they could be just very successful businessmen that are, have been in the IT space or the healthcare space. And they'll give you a sense of what's going on with your kind of technology. Also, they're probably pretty tied into what else is going on out there and what the VCs are kind of playing with. I think it's important, though, as you go through it, if you find a VC that, and it could be Finny, that it just becomes a friend, like it's just a casual conversation, because as you go, they're going to be kind of looking at you. Are you achieving your milestones? You're going to come in, you're going to start the dialogue with a VC or anybody that's going to give you money, and it's not going to be like tomorrow they give you money. It's going to be 3 to 6 months, right? They're going to want to kind of see, one, it takes that long to close a deal just because of all the due diligence and all the hurdles you have to jump through. But they're also kind of checking, are you doing what you say you're doing? You put forth a plan, so are you achieving on that plan? Because that's a kind of gauge of how dedicated you are to the company, how when you say you're going to do this, will you do this? Because ultimately, someone's giving you money because you're going to achieve some goal, and they want to get a sense of, are you achieving?
That's a very important point, and this is one of the dirty little secrets of venture that probably most firms do this. We do this. We actually keep a database of all of our meetings with slides, with all those sorts of things, and then when the person comes back a year later, 2 years later, we say, oh, before the meeting goes up, I go to that database, I pull up the slides, and I'll look at their proposed P&L, and they said, oh, 2014, they said they were going to get $5 million of revenue. And I'll sit down and say, how did you do in 2014? And it's a great benchmark. So it's something that you're absolutely right. What Tom was saying in terms of this cultivation of a relationship, which can work to your benefit or not, depending on whether or not you're hitting your proposed goals.
And I want to touch upon the second question. I think that we've probably indirectly covered a little bit in terms of how do you pick your investor, and not all investors are interested in the same technologies, right? So I get that question a lot from clients that come in on their early stage companies, and they say, Josh, how do I target where I want to pitch, or who's most likely to invest in this? So first, right, there's always the networking component, right? I mean, I, for example, make referrals to VCs all the time on behalf of my clients or other investors. So my client may say, I'll know what they're doing. I'll learn about their business, and based on other clients that I have that are in a comparable space, I'll say, well, I think so and so would be a good person to talk to, and I'll often help with the introduction. Other ways you can do research on your own if you don't have kind of the network, right, or the connection to be able to do that, is actually, the typical nowadays, right, the online research, right? There's a lot of information out there about who invests in what companies, and what, venture capital firms have portfolio companies that are in the following space. So my advice to my clients is always you want to be thinking about somebody who's knowledgeable. They have experience investing that are companies that are comparable to yours, similar to yours, but you don't want the direct competitor for a variety of reasons. One, they either will not invest in your company because there's a conflict of interest and they don't want to be in that position, or certainly you wouldn't want necessarily, for example, confidential proprietary information even inadvertently going into a board member's hands who then has it and is going to be talking to another company. So you don't want to find somebody who's invested in a direct competitor, but you want to find somebody who's in the general space close to it, because A, they know the space, so they're more likely to be interested in your company, and also, again, back to the value add. They're probably going to be a better fit for you in the long run in terms of helping you move the business forward. As far as the first question a little bit, my thoughts in terms of the conversations that I have and what I see with my clients, is there almost a too early? Certainly not too early to talk, but I find more and more in this day and age, I do think it's difficult to, based just on the idea alone, get the investment. There have been certainly points in the last decade and certainly niche markets where the hot companies do get those types of investments. But I think by and large, particularly in the companies that you're talking about, probably, revenue's great. If it's not revenue, customer traction, right? So you can show the beta testing or the pilot testing with potential customers, something that shows that, when you go to the investor, you've moved this along beyond just the prototype that isn't being evaluated by anyone. So that's what I see more and more in this day and age. Yes.
Josh, you started in the beginning with of this question sequence with what's most important to the investor.
Yes, thanks.
And so I'd ask Finny that, and in your experience, what's the most compelling thing that you, Finny, look at as an investor to hear of a potential, drug company development?
Yeah, I mean, so I would actually put the team number one in that sequence, and the reason for that is several-fold. Is so often you have to adjust and course correct. It's very rare that a company comes to you with a business plan, and by the time they're all done, it's what they thought it was going to be. And great teams, great people, they know how to handle that. They can deal with the change. They can do amazing things, and they can make lemonade out of lemons, as they say. And if you have a great group of academics, if you had an Eric Lander behind you, or a David Baltimore, or somebody like that, I mean, that's going to be such an eye-popping experience for any venture investor that they would take a lot of notice there. And if you have done previous, if you're coming as a Series B, for example, who invested in your Series A? That's extremely important for all investors. So I would say that's definitely the number one. And then number two, I would say the technology and the drugs. Obviously, you need a fundamental business plan that's going to work there.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add maybe is a little bit more color on the team and the importance of the team and how to think about that, because not everyone, for example, is experienced, right? Not everyone's the serial entrepreneur who's sold the company and is coming back to a venture capital firm. VCs are obviously going to be much more inclined to invest in them, right? Because they did it once. Whether or not it was all them or primarily them is irrelevant, right? It's the perception that they can do it again, or they're more likely to do it again than somebody else. So certainly experience, having done it before, I think is critical. But let's say you're somebody who doesn't have that experience, right? I still think that the things that you look at, particularly for early stage companies, right, is the experience that they do have. Maybe not in running the company, but what distinguishes them on the science or the technology from other entrepreneurs? Why are the individuals who are involved with this at a competitive advantage because of what they've been doing either in the lab or because of experience that they've had before starting this venture? Other things to think about: full-time. I mean, I see entrepreneurs who have a day job working on this at the side. That's not going to sit well with investors, right? They want you showing that you believe in this, that you're committed to this, and clearly the more time you're spending on something, the more likely it is to be successful. It's only natural the more time you put into something. So I think that sometimes is something that entrepreneurs are the risk takers, but oftentimes don't really take that risk completely, at least not in the early stages of a company, and it can really slow things down, and I think lead to that question with the investors. I've certainly seen that come up, and I don't think it can be underestimated. Yes, yeah.
So what you just said about, do this on the side. So what if you are committed in case you get investment to go in full time, but you can't really afford it because you need to live off something?
That's so often the story, and certainly you have to sell that, and I think investors do understand that in terms of you're going to be working on this full time as soon as that term sheet is given from the investors. So I think that's understandable, but if you do think about it in terms of the early stages, getting to that point where you're even getting the term sheet, it can be challenging for someone who's not fully engaged, and it takes a little bit more, I think, on the pitch to show that you're really committed to doing this over the long run. So it comes up, you're right, it is a question that can be answered, but I think it's something that one shouldn't forget as you're going out and having conversations, because you can imagine having 10 conversations where I'm at this, part-time right now. Think about it put yourself in an investor's perspective. How does that sound? And also, if I think that as an investor, I may not want to invest now, I may want to see further development of the technology or the product. That could be the difference between waiting 3 months and waiting a year, depending on what somebody's putting in, and then you may have lost your opportunity, right? Because you may not get another bite at the apple, so to speak.
And if I could add one thing to your previous comments, Josh, about not having to be an experienced entrepreneur. That's completely right. You can compensate for not being experienced yourself, which I would assume most people here have not done this many, many times, by assembling a great SAB. So an SAB, or Scientific Advisory Board, is another powerful way of leveraging your relationships here at Harvard and MIT. I mean, within a 5-mile radius of this spot here is the highest density of superstars and talent in the world. There's no doubt about that. And one of the great ways you can show yourself to be an amazing company and prospect of a company is to start building those relationships with all the faculty that you know now. SABs are, even though a lot of people on the outside think that that's where the ideas are formed, they're usually not. They're usually more trophies, and they're usually more a sign of how good your idea is, and the fact that you can attract really smart, good people behind it. And I would encourage all of you at this stage to really start to think about who are the faculty that I'm building relationships with, who are those people that I can be mentors to me now. There's a lot of people in this area who are fantastic academics who have also founded many, many great companies.
It doesn't, and then just to answer your point about, everybody has to make a living, pay the bills, but they have this idea and they're moving along. And I think it kind of cuts across everything. If you can show that you're progressing it along, that goes a long way. If it's this idea, and as you start the conversation with Finny, and over a year, it's still an idea, well, you've proven that that's all it's ever going to be. But if you can show that you're moving it along, and that you're aggressively trying to hit goals and really important goals, that goes a long way to kind of say, hey, listen, I'm doing this. I'm progressing this. Yes, I have this other job to pay my rent, but I'm actually achieving something. The second thing, and it's just not so much SAB, but also people that have been there and done it in the kind of running the company world. Again, in the 5-mile radius, there are a lot of people that have built biotech companies, sold biotech companies, and are constantly now trying to look for the next biotech company they can help because they just love startups, and they have the time to kind of just help startups get going. And again, in Harvard, I got to believe there's this network that you can kind of pull on to try to start to meet these people, because that will, no doubt, the names that will go off on that will like check the box for the VC. And that kind of goes a long way, where you might not have the SAB, you might have one scientific person, but you might have someone that's been there and done it in the kind of biotech world, has taken a startup, done it, sold it. They don't want to really kind of run a company again, but they want to be maybe on the board and be a founder in the company. And that might be something that, again, is good for you because it allows you to kind of accelerate the process.
So I want to make sure this wasn't scripted. We don't have to stick with the questions that are on the quiz. These were just intended to, foster discussion. I want to ask one more question, and then we can give time for kind of open Q&A and go completely off topic in any way that helps all of you. So the one question I'll ask to kind of close is, so we've talked about approaching investors. Now I want to talk about maybe the stage of negotiation. So for each of you, when you're in that conversation where an investor has demonstrated interest in your company, what do you think are going to be the most sensitive topics, from your perspective, from the VC's perspective? What can swing the deal one way or the other in terms of you wanting to do a deal with that particular investor? What terms of the financing are going to be most important to you or most hotly debated? And we'll get the panel's thoughts on it, but I'd like to start with the audience from the entrepreneur's perspective. Yes?
The amount of control that the firm has versus the entrepreneur.
Yes.
Valuation, liquidation preferences.
Okay. So we'll start with Tom. Out of either those or any others, what do you think are the most important deal terms that people focus on, or that you would recommend these entrepreneurs focus on?
I think those are two of the bigger ones that come up with a lot of companies. I think also understanding the voting, right? How the votes are going to happen. There are different voting scenarios for if you want to go out and raise more money, or if you want to bring in a new investor, or if you want to add a board seat, or if you want to go out and raise debt, or the devil's in the detail, and it's always about the same thing: who can do what, and what do you need to actually get approval to do it, right? And what I constantly tell people that are starting companies, or and I'm no guru. It's, again, I don't think I'm reinventing the wheel. You're giving up something. Someone's about to give you a whole lot of money, and and they're placing a bet on you. They want something in return. It's not, I'm blindly giving you the money and I'll see you in 5 years and I hope it goes really well. I'm giving you money, but we need to kind of make sure that there are checks and balances here. And you have to be willing to give that. If you go in adamantly saying, just give me the money, you'll get a board seat, I'll talk to you every other month, and that's it, and that's the mentality that you think you're going to have in this deal, then it's going to be a very quick negotiation. So you got to be willing, but understand the nuances, because you might be thinking that you're getting something, but then when you start to realize what votes are needed to do certain things, you really didn't get what you needed. And so understanding that, and valuation is always going to be the key, and that's why a lot of companies are not going to VCs until further down the path, because you don't control valuation if it's an idea and you just start, it's a hit, right? You're trying to develop a drug discovery company and you have a hit and you're trying to, that's like, okay. And, but if you're closer to a development candidate, which is a year away from phase one, you have a lot more power to drive the valuation.
So Finny, as an investor, what are you most focused on when you as an investor are negotiating a financing and the terms?
Yeah, I mean, the issues that have been raised are the big ones. So pre-money valuation, control, board composition, and how those dynamics are the big ones. What I would say, probably the biggest piece of advice I would give on this is a lot of the board dynamics, those tend to often be sort of inter-investor wars, and they tend to have a lot of squabbles about what all that looks like. And usually it's not something that the inventor has to get too involved in, although there are some times that happens. But on the valuation piece, which is what most people think about when they think about the venture side, I always advocate as my default position for people to say, let the market decide. So you're going to go out and present your idea to lots of people. And if you go in there with an overly rigid notion of what you think it's worth, people won't think it's reasonable. You're not going to get a $50 million pre-money on a preclinical idea. That's not realistic. And there's a fairly accepted range of valuation that come with early stage idea. They're almost always sub $10 million pre-monies. And more often than not, the market speaks with a reasonable amount of clarity if you go to several good venture firms. And so I would say on the valuation part, it shows a good amount of humility and at the same time confidence as well. So if you go in and you have a great idea and you say let the market, we're going to let the market speak here, I think investors really appreciate that, and I think it's a sign of not being immature. Whereas I remember one of the very first companies that I interacted with, the person came in with this completely ridiculous notion of valuation. And they seemed arrogant, they didn't really seem like they understood things, and the company never did get funded. They went around to lots of different investors.
So I want to add, from my perspective as a lawyer who's helping my clients negotiate term sheets and understand them and compare multiple term sheets when they're fortunate enough to get it, I'm going to challenge something that has been said in the audience and by both of the panelists, the emphasis on valuation. Very important, clearly helps determine what percentage of the company the investor is taking for their investment, and as a result, what percentage of the company the founding team is keeping. But never look at it in a vacuum. And I think, and this may have been hinted by the audience member who mentioned valuation, it was immediately followed by liquidation preference. And while I didn't follow up on what was meant by that, for those of you who may not be familiar with what a liquidation preference is, right? Literally, it is the right of investors to get their money back first before any money is distributed upon a sale of the company, the liquidation being broadly defined to be a sale of the company. So positive, negative, whatever the sale price is, investors get their money back first. In this day and age, for most early stage companies, the liquidation preference is very routine. It's standard in that it's only you get the money back first. 1 times, your money back first, not 1.5 times, 2x. That would be a multiple liquidation preference. Those are not very common in this day and age, particularly for early stage companies. But the key part of the liquidation preference that maybe the audience member was getting at is whether or not there's participation associated with that, which means when the investors get preferred stock, they also get, in addition to the right to get their money back first upon a liquidation, upon a sale of the company, they also get to participate. They get their money back first, and then based on the percentage ownership of the company that they have, they get the remaining proceeds they get to share with the common stockholders, with the founders. Why is that critical? Because you could have 2 term sheets, one with a slightly better valuation, one that has participating preferred stock, where after they get their money back, the investors get to share with the common stockholders, and then you could get slightly worse valuation with non-participating preferred stock. So they basically get to choose. They get either their money back first, or they get to share in the proceeds with the common stockholders based on their percentage interest in the company. Don't underestimate how those 2 provisions actually work together, because the term sheet that looks better on its face that you might be more excited about because you got a better valuation, if you actually run some numbers based on how much you think you'd like to sell this company for or where the sales are most likely to be, you could get, because of the double dip, the associated preferred stock rights that come along with getting your money back first and participating in the company, could result in you getting less upon a sale of the company than you would get if you had accepted the term sheet with the lower valuation and giving up a little bit better percentage of your company because they had to choose. They didn't get their money back and a right to participate. So something that I think about a lot, that I see And that, again, I think the interplay between different provisions is important to think about and work through with someone.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And liquidation preferences and the waterfalls, there's a lot of science and art behind all this. And for those who didn't understand anything that he said, because it can be very overwhelming. I remember when I first joined the industry, I thought straight preferred, pursuing preferred, what is all this? There's a great book which I recommend to people. It's called it's by Andrew Metrick. He's a professor at Wharton. It's called Venture Capital and the Finance of Innovation, and he goes through lots of examples and shows exactly how this all plays out. And there's spreadsheets that come with it, so you can get a feel for how that works. But it is very important, and you're absolutely right. Purchasing preferred, which is rare, at least that people would do at our stage at a Series A, is something to be very careful about.
And it's, as Josh just showed, it's important to get a good lawyer.
It is.
Josh is my corporate attorney. I've known Josh for 12 years, or a little bit more. But it gets complex, and you have about 15 other things you're trying to do at the same time. You're trying to run the company that you're starting to show that you're proving, you're moving along, you're hitting your goals because the VCs are watching that. Are you continuing to hit your goals? You're trying to now negotiate this agreement that you've never negotiated before, and these agreements are thick. There's the purchase agreement, there's the investor rights agreement, there's a voting agreement, I think I have 5 agreements for Hydra that have been negotiated 4 different times as we've gone through our Series A, B, C, and D. And Josh, like the VCs, have seen these agreements countless times, probably more times than you ever want to admit. And so they can tell you what the pitfalls are. And I can't stress enough, you can go out and get a lawyer, and I'm not doing this, there are tons of law firms like Wilmer Hill, although I think they're the best. You can go out and get a lawyer that is $100 an hour, right? Because you just want to get the lawyer to help look at it. Or you can go out and pay for one of the high-end law firms or the mid-tier law firms. It's worth the money. What you think you're saving is going to screw you, pardon my language, but will screw you in the end because they don't understand and they haven't seen all the things that you're about to negotiate. It's worth the money. I've been there.
Okay, so now I'd love to open it up to questions. Looks like we have one here. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to gain some knowledge regarding the medical device company development, could you give us some kind of example or real story, like about one company has one product, like with the different development stage, how much money they get from the venture capital or whatever, and how many shares they give it off. So just use some real story to give us some common sense.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that either of the two panelists want to talk specifically about medical device companies. I mean, in terms of fundraising in general, we could probably give you a better sense, but obviously if you've seen it and want to specifically talk about that, feel free.
I haven't seen any medical.
Yeah,
device.
we've done. I'm on the SAB for a company called NanoString. I was on the board of NanoString. It's a medical device company in the diagnostic space, and we've done a couple of those at Clarus. Yeah, I would say generally you need less capital to get those companies off the ground. Usually you're going to do a 510K, not a PMA, as we talked about before. The downside is that there's a lot less people who are funding medical devices. So the vast majority of the dollars that are out there today are going into therapeutics. And the reason for that is that the diagnostic space and the device space has proven historically to generate lower returns. And so the market being what it is, investors have said, hey, if I'm not getting the returns that I'm getting in the therapeutic side, I'm going to put more on the therapeutic side. And so the last few years have really seen a dramatic decline in, especially in the Boston area, of companies that are funded in the medical device space. It can be done, and there's still great opportunities there, but they're fewer and more challenging to attain. In terms of just rough numbers here, this is going to vary tremendously depending on where you are. To get to the PMA, or to get to the 510K is relatively inexpensive. Where it's a lot more costly is the commercial ramp. So where most device stories tend to be stories where you don't generate an exit, so an exit being a sale of the company or an IPO, until you actually demonstrate a real sales ramp. In the biotech world, it's very different. A lot of companies get bought out at phase 2 or phase 3 well before they've achieved sales. In the device world, it's not like that. And so because of that, there tends to be a lot greater need for commercial sophistication and the ability to grow a sales force and launch a product, which is a whole skill in and of its own right. And that's very expensive. So raising a sales force, deploying a sales force, trying to procure reimbursement from the various payers that are out there. So I would say you can often see companies that can get from idea to 510K with maybe $20 million, something like that. But then to get to profitability, often it's another 50 or 60 or more $1 million to actually get the product out there. So be very, very careful on the commercial side. Most people, this is to the question that was raised before, most people are not sophisticated enough on the commercial side, and you've got to be 10x more sophisticated if you're going to be on the device side.
And one thing that I heard as part of the question as well was, what kind of control might you be giving up? And I'll just comment a little bit on my experience in terms of when I see term sheets come in. This is broad, but not just in the device industry. So I'm going to be a little bit of a cynic here, a little bit of an anti-investor here. I think it's always odd that that you see valuations come out in the ranges that they do for so many early stage companies. And the reason why I think that is because it's hard to value early stage companies in most cases. And if you think about it, say you're looking for $5 to $8 million in your first round of investment, just as an example, a little bit less than a drug development company might be looking for. And you know that the VCs or the angels that you're talking to are going to want probably 33% of your company on the low end, probably asking for as much as 50% if they can get it, depending on how much leverage you have, how hot a company you are. You end up backing into the valuation, right? They're looking for that percentage of the company, and you know how much money that you're going to put in once the parties agree to that. So valuation ranges actually, in my experience, tend to be fairly predictable, or at least within a reasonable range of predictability because of the other two factors, which goes to your question about control and how much of the company you're giving up. Yes?
I've got a question on the round of financing. So I'd be curious if you could share a few stories of how you structure it. As I think Tom mentioned, it's basically you're going to achieve a big milestones, and that's the end of your Series A. That's why you ask for the money. But how much time and effort is that, and what are the typical stages? And the second part of the question is, once you're done with Series A, you say that basically who you chose for Series A is going to heavily determine Series B. So if you could share, like, maybe keep the same investor type of storyline versus, oh, now it's time to actually broaden the scope and get more guys on board.
Yeah, so I'll take a shot at that, and others can speak. So the normal pattern is you raise your Series A, and one of the other reasons why it's so important to select your investors is, as you said, it's very rare that they won't participate in later rounds. And that's for multiple reasons. One is that they want to preserve the ownership that they've generated in their Series A. But secondly, it looks really bad if you're trying to raise a Series B and you're going out and telling everybody, my Series A investors aren't going to invest in the Series B. That's almost a kiss of death, in fact. So people recognize when they're putting in a Series A that they're in this for the long haul. They're in this for the exit. And so they're going to put some reserves into their fund for those later rounds. The normal mechanism is that the insiders will participate in the B and C and all the rest, but there'll be one or more new investors who will come in and price the round. So by convention, it's considered good form to let another investor come in and speak to what value should be for that company. If the insiders are just determining the value every step along the way, people don't take it as seriously as whether or not there's been an outside investor. So normally you'll have those one or two people come in, and then the penultimate round before an IPO, you'll often go out and look for so-called crossover investors. So there's a whole array of investors in this area who are particularly skilled at assessing opportunities right before an IPO. And some of them might be the Fidelities of the world, but there's other shops that are not just mutual funds that are very good at doing that. And so this is part of what I was talking about before, is that you're going to get introductions to all those people who are going to be your new investors in the Bs and the Cs and your crossovers from the people who did your Series A. And so we spend a lot of our time shopping our companies to later investors. I mean, I would say that, I don't know, when we're working with our existing companies, maybe a quarter of our time, a third of our time is spent co-marketing the company with other investors. And so you've got to make sure that you've got a good syndicate right off the bat. It's hard to give a generalization about how many rounds of financing are required before an exit, but I would say it's unusual that before an IPO or for a trade sale that you go past a D or an E. If there is, then there's probably something wrong with the company, or there's been a restart or something like that.
Yeah, I think that it all goes to how you're funding like what, we haven't talked about it, but it's my big thing since I'm a finance guy, the budget, right? Your plan, right? Understanding how much money you think you need to kind of raise to get to that next valuation point. And then what do you think you're going to need after that? And in biotech companies, there's actually a lot of different levers because every time you do a round, you dilute yourself, right? And there'll be a true up mechanism to kind of make you whole or get you back to not whole, but a different point. But there's always this balance of going out and raising money and what you might be able to monetize with your company. And so as a biotech company, how I think about it, I've done it, is it's a jigsaw puzzle. Usually you have the VCs that have money, you have venture debt, you have equipment debt, you have your own internal assets. Usually you might have one or two programs that you're kind of working towards to kind of bring forward. Well, one of those can become an asset that you can actually flip to raise money, do a partnership deal, a license deal with a biotech company. They give you an upfront, they fund your FTEs, usually for a little bit more money than what it costs to have an FTE. And through that mechanism, you're kind of moving the company along. Hydra from 2009 to now, outside of the VC money, we raised $52 million just through partnership deals we did to help fund the company. So we've almost raised as much money as we brought in from VCs with our own like legwork and doing deals. And so yeah, as you think about it, there's A, B, C, D. But along the way, you don't want to just keep going from A, B, C, D if you can avoid it. If you can kind of bring your own money to the table through kind of monetizing something in your company that might not be the value driver, but something that someone else, and it goes back to understanding the budget, understanding the plan. You need to understand that. I often laugh. The first time I started Infinity, I was talking with the CEO at the time, Steve Holtzman. He founded the company. He's like, all right, let's do a budget. We'll have 60 employees, 300,000, that's the budget. And I was like, how do we get there, right? And over time, what you learn is that is actually meaningless. That's a good kind of like rule of thumb to start the conversation, but really building your budget up. And I would say this for IT companies, med device companies, biotech companies, understanding how you're going to spend the money is important because it's going to give you two things. One, levers you can control. If you're not hitting the goals the way you thought you would be, maybe you can slow down spend some way to help you achieve that goal to trigger the second tranche. But it's also going to allow you to kind of understand, how much money you think you're going to need to, get to this valuation point and to the next valuation point. And when you're talking to VCs, if you can't actually talk fluently about your budget and how you're going to spend the money, they won't give you money because, that's like flushing it down the toilet. And then just as it relates to A, B, C, D, don't think IPO. It's funny, I'm always in conversations where that's one of the exit strategies. People always put up an IPO, M&A. The amount of companies that go public are like negligible. It's like winning a lottery ticket, right? So you got to think about how you're funding this company to get to a valuation point where someone might acquire you. And if you're at that point, then you might be able to actually go public, right? But it's all about, understanding that world. It's a lot there, but I want to get in the budget. That was my big thing going into this thing. You got to understand your numbers and how much you think it's going to cost, because everything else we just talked about is meaningless.
Okay. I think we'll take this as the last question, and then we'll all the panelists will hang around for a little bit, and you feel free to come up and we can talk more. Yes.
So I have a question primarily for Finny, but a lot of activity in sort of connected health, wireless, wellness, fitness, wearables. As an investor that's primarily focused on life sciences and medical devices, are you looking? Are you investing? Is it danger Will Robinson and out of scope? So just any comments on all of that activity and how more traditional sort of life sciences investors are viewing that opportunity.
Right. Yeah. So I would say there certainly are there's a lot of talk about it, and there's a lot of companies that have been started around this. There is a bit of a West Coast, East Coast division. So the West Coast is usually where those plays tend to come from, the wearables, a lot of that. The East Coast tends to be more of an enterprise-facing investing dimension, whereas the West Coast tends to be more of a consumer-facing dimension. as a rough generalization. And so I think certainly at our firm, we have not invested in that. The challenge there in that space is because the barriers of entry are ostensibly low, there's just so much competition on the wearable side, for example. I mean, I don't know how many companies that are out there now that purport to have some mechanism for recording some biometric data and putting that on the cloud and trying to tell you something useful about it. And there haven't been a lot of great examples of companies that have successfully monetized that and generated great exits yet. And so I think because of that, there's, I would say, more skepticism than there is enthusiasm from my vantage point, until there's maybe some more proven examples. That being said, I think the enterprise side is, in my opinion, a lot more interesting. We're very close to Athena Health, which is one of the most successful cloud companies on the planet on the healthcare side, and they've done an amazing job of offering a very innovative product to healthcare that I think is legitimately has the opportunity to revolutionize the healthcare IT space. And I think there's a company here called Clarus, which is, we're not investors in it, but they have this really neat idea of transforming the way that patients are matched to doctors. So if you think about Expedia and how Expedia has changed the whole airline industry, where there's a much more efficient matching of people who want to fly with airlines because of competition and an open marketplace. And you look at the healthcare system today, it is terribly inefficient. I mean, the margins are very low. There's a lot of idle space in a realm where there's tremendous fixed costs. The whole enterprise space, the whole hospital space is waiting to be revolutionized with people who can have great ideas. Now it's tough to do that because they're big institutions that are not easy to change, and they tend to be just generally slow. But I believe that one of the big leg up over the next 10 to 20 years is going to be people who can successfully demonstrate efficiencies and improvements, and especially in the post Affordable Care Act world. So I'm very excited about that space, and we're looking at that space too, even at our firm.
Great. Well, thank you to Finny and Tom for joining us this evening, and thank you all for coming.